At my son's 40th birthday party, more than 200 guests applauded as my daughter-in-law stepped onto the stage holding a microphone. Smiling, she rested a hand on her belly and said, "I'm pregnant, and the greatest gift you can give your son is to disappear from our lives forever." I turned to my son, waiting for him to stop her. Instead, he raised his glass and said, "She's right, Mom." I quietly walked out, packed one suitcase, and left the city. Exactly 24 hours later, my phone was flooded with missed calls. Thank you for being here with me. Before we begin, drop a quick comment. How are you feeling today? In one word, your perspective matters more than you might think. A quick note, some details in this story have been adjusted for reflection and storytelling. The message is what I hope stays with you. Celeste Ashford walked into my son's birthday party wearing the wrong outfit entirely. That was the first thing I noticed. Not her face, not the way she positioned herself slightly ahead of her daughter as they moved through the Piedmont Room at the St. Regis Atlanta. The outfit. A structured black pantsuit, pressed sharp, the kind women wear when they are going somewhere that requires authority. Not to a Tuesday evening birthday celebration with 200 guests and champagne already poured. I am Constance Whitfield, 68 years old. I founded a rehabilitation network that has quietly served Atlanta for 3 decades, and I know how to read a room before the room knows it is being read. Celeste Ashford, 65, and carrying herself with composed posture, walked in 2 steps behind her daughter with deliberate movement. Warren's wife, Miriam Lockwood, 32, and visibly pregnant, stood beside her mother with careful posture. Too careful, the kind that comes from knowing exactly where you are supposed to be. I filed the information quietly in the place where I keep things I am not ready to speak out loud yet. My son, Warren Lockwood, 40 years old, and dressed in a suit that cost more than his first car, moved through the ballroom with the ease of someone who believed tonight belonged to him. When he reached me, he smiled, hugged me, said the right words. "Mom, you made it." But his eyes did not meet mine, not once during the embrace. I have known this man for 40 years. I know what it means when he will not look at me. The ballroom was everything a 40th birthday should be. Fresh flowers, a live band, the scent of perfume and red wine, 200 guests in their finest moving through conversations with practiced ease. Miriam smiled at someone across the room. "Everyone's here now, we can begin." I sat down, watched the room, watched Celeste glancing at her daughter, watched Miriam checking her phone, watched Warren keeping his distance even though I was seated at the family table. And I understood. I had not been invited to a birthday party. I had been invited to a conclusion. The food came. Conversation moved the way it moves when people are performing normalcy. Careful, surface level, nobody saying the thing already sitting in the middle of the table. Warren talked about the project in vague terms with redirects I had noticed but not named. Celeste smiled at everything and said very little. She was conserving herself. 90 minutes passed. The staff cleared the main course. Someone dimmed the lights for what I assumed would be cake. Instead, Miriam stood up with deliberate movement. She did not excuse herself. She simply stood, walked to the center of the room, and a staff member handed her a wireless microphone. The room went quiet. Miriam smiled, held the microphone like someone who had practiced, looked out across 200 faces, and let the silence build. "I have an announcement," she said. The room leaned in. Warren and I are expecting. The ballroom erupted. Applause, laughter, champagne glasses raised. I felt my chest fill with something that might have been joy if I had not already understood what was coming. I stood up, moved toward Miriam to embrace her. This was my grandchild, my son's child. Miriam stepped back, not a small step. A deliberate step that created space between us in a way that made everyone notice. "Don't touch me," she said. The applause died like someone had cut a wire. If you are watching this right now, I want you to understand something about betrayal. The worst kind does not arrive in the dark. It does not whisper. It stands in front of 200 people under chandelier lighting and speaks clearly enough that no one can pretend they did not hear. Miriam raised her glass, looked directly at me. "The best gift you can give your son," she said, her voice steady, "is to disappear forever. If you ever show up in Warren's life again, you will never see your grandchild." The silence that followed was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of something heavier. 200 people holding their breath, 200 witnesses. I turned to look at my son. Warren stood 3 feet away. I searched his face for surprise, for anger, for any indication this was not something he had agreed to. He looked directly at me and said without hesitation, "I think she's right, Mom." 3 words, spoken with the ease of a man who had already made his peace with them. I sat with those 3 words for what might have been 3 seconds or 3 hours. I felt something move through me that was not grief and was not rage. It was clarity. The specific, irreversible kind that arrives when something you have suspected quietly for a long time finally decides to show you its face. I reached for my napkin, folded it once, twice, placed it on the table with the precision of someone using every remaining ounce of energy just to keep from shattering. Then I stood up. The couple 2 tables over had gone quiet. The silence had weight, and everyone in that ballroom was sitting underneath it. I picked up my purse, pushed back my chair, did not look at Warren, did not look at Miriam, did not look at Celeste standing 2 steps behind her daughter with the small smile of a woman who believed she had just watched something finish. I did not speak to anyone, and I left my son's party for the last time. By the time I reached Interstate 20 westbound, my phone had already begun its work without me. I had walked out of the St. Regis into the Atlanta night, got into my car, set my purse on the passenger seat, and for 30 seconds I sat there in the parking garage with the engine off, staring at the concrete wall in front of me. Then I started the car and drove home. I packed 1 bag in 23 minutes. I did not sit down once. Took what I needed from the closet, the bathroom, the dresser. Clothes for 3 days. Toiletries. The folder of documents I keep in the safe. I moved through my house with the efficiency of someone who has already decided and does not need to waste time questioning the decision. I was not crying, I was not shaking, I was remembering. By 11:47 that night, I was on Interstate 20 westbound with 1 bag in the back seat and my phone face up on the passenger seat vibrating. Warren. I watched his name light up the screen. Watched it ring until the vibration stopped. Then it started again. Warren. I did not answer. I turned the phone face down and kept driving. The highway was mostly empty at that hour. A few long-haul trucks, the occasional sedan with out-of-state plates. The kind of traffic you see when everyone on the road has somewhere to be that cannot wait until morning. I thought about 1994. That was the year I opened the first rehabilitation center, a small facility on the west side of Atlanta with 12 beds and a staff of 6. I had a $200,000 loan from a community bank and my husband's co-signature because my credit alone was not enough to secure the financing. We sat in that bank on a Tuesday morning in March. The loan officer had looked at me across his desk and asked if I understood the risk. If I understood that most small healthcare facilities fail within the first 3 years. If I had a contingency plan for when the revenue did not materialize the way I projected it would. My husband had reached across the table and signed his name on the line below mine without hesitation. That night, sitting in our kitchen with the loan documents spread across the table, he had said something I never forgot. "You build this thing so it stays after you're gone. Don't let anyone take it away." He passed in 2018, a year before Warren came to me with the expansion idea, a year before I started building the next phase of what we had created together. The phone vibrated again. I glanced down. Warren. I let it ring out, then another call, then another. I watched the screen light up with his name over and over, and I did not touch it. What do you do when the person you protected most carefully becomes the one who destroys you most completely? I had spent 40 years of my life making sure Warren never had to face the weight of what it took to build something real. I had carried the risk. Signed my name on the documents, put my reputation on the line, let him walk into rooms believing the floor beneath his feet was solid, because I had never told him about the times I had to shore up the foundation in the middle of the night when no one was watching. I had protected him so completely that he grew up inside a structure without ever learning what held the ceiling up. And tonight he had stood in front of 200 people and told me I was the problem. The city lights began to thin. The highway stretched darker. I crossed from Fulton County into Douglas County. Then Carol. The phone kept vibrating. I thought about Celeste Ashford in that black pantsuit. I thought about Miriam stepping back when I tried to embrace her. I thought about the way the room had gone silent. I thought about Warren's face when he looked at me and said those 3 words without flinching. "I think she's right, Mom." Not "I'm sorry," not "Can we talk about this?" Just agreement, immediate, unquestioning, as if he had been waiting for permission to say what he had been thinking all along. I did not know what I would do next. I only knew the woman driving on Interstate 20 tonight was not the woman who had sat in that ballroom 3 hours ago. Something had shifted in the space between putting that napkin down and walking out the door. I did not know what to call it yet, but it felt a lot like clarity. The skyline was still visible in my rearview mirror when I passed the last Atlanta exit. I watched it shrink the way you watch something you built slowly disappear. Not with panic, not with tears, but with the particular ache of knowing exactly what you are leaving behind and why you are leaving it anyway. I had lived in Atlanta for 31 years, raised my son in this city, built a professional life on the currency that matters most in the rooms I move through, my word. Yeah. And my son had just tried to erase me in front of everyone who knew that word was worth something. I crossed the state line into Alabama just after 1 in the morning. The phone had stopped vibrating. I glanced down. 17 missed calls, all from Warren. I kept driving. Birmingham appeared in the distance. Low lights, quiet streets. The kind of city that goes to sleep early on a Tuesday night and does not ask questions about who arrives after midnight. I pulled into the Redmond Hotel just before 2 in the morning, parked in the lot, turned off the engine, sat there in the dark with my hands still on the wheel. The night clerk at the Redmond, a woman in her 50s who had seen enough late-night arrivals not to ask questions, handed me a key to room 214 without meeting my eyes. "Second floor, ma'am, elevator to your right." I took the key, carried my bag upstairs, opened the door to a room that looked like every hotel room I had ever stayed in, clean, impersonal, a bed, a desk, a chair by the window overlooking a street I did not know. I sat in that chair without turning on the light, looked out at Birmingham, a city I had not been to in years. I did not know what to call what I was feeling yet, but it felt a lot like clarity, and clarity I was beginning to understand can be more dangerous than rage. Clarity can be more dangerous than rage, but only if you know how to use it. I sat in room 214 at the Redmond Hotel with my coat still on, watching the phone light up against the pale wood of the nightstand. 23 missed calls by 2:47 a.m. I did not answer a single one. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old carpet. Outside, Birmingham's streets were empty, lit by sodium lamps that turned the pavement the color of old honey. I sat in the chair by the window with my hands folded in my lap, and I thought about foundations. I had purchased the land in 2019, not Whitfield Rehabilitation Network, not Warren, me. Constance Whitfield in my personal name because the bank financing the Birmingham expansion required a personal guarantee, and only my credit history, 34 years of building something from nothing, was sufficient to secure the terms we needed. Warren had been 36, then eager and competent, and when I told him the structure made sense for liability reasons, he nodded and signed where I asked him to sign. He never asked why the DCH medical operating license listed me as the primary operator. He never wondered why the Medicare certification bore my signature, not his. He never questioned why certain approvals came through so easily, or why Preston Gallagher, who had been our attorney for 9 years by then, always copied me on correspondence Warren assumed was routine. The strongest foundations are the ones nobody sees until they need to hold weight. I had not planned this revenge in 2019. I had simply built the business the way I always built things, carefully with an eye toward risk, with my name on documents that mattered. But sitting in that hotel room with my coat on and my phone lighting up every 11 minutes, I realized something Preston must have understood years ago. Every piece of the Birmingham expansion, the land, the operating authority, the federal certifications required my signature, not as a formality, as a legal necessity. Warren could not sell what he did not own. At 6 a.m., when the sky outside turned from black to charcoal, I picked up my phone and dialed Clayton Mercer. He was 58 and one of Atlanta's most respected healthcare regulatory attorneys, a man who had guided us through 3 federal audits without a single citation. He picked up on the first ring despite the hour. "Constance," he said. His voice was alert. He had always been an early riser. "I need you to do something for me," I said. "Warren is meeting with Whitmore and Associates at 9 o'clock this morning to finalize the Birmingham sale. I need you to be available when that meeting falls apart." There was a pause, then, "What am I looking for?" "A phone call," I said. "Probably around 9:15. He'll need someone to explain what just happened." "And what just happened?" "He tried to sell something that was never his to sell." Clayton was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, "I'll keep my line open." I hung up. The phone immediately lit up again. Call 27, Warren and I set it face down on the nightstand. If you have ever built something from nothing, you understand this. The strongest foundations are the ones nobody sees until they need to hold weight. I learned what happened in that boardroom from Clayton Mercer, who heard it directly from Reginald Fontaine, who had been Preston Gallagher's lead representative for 9 years, and was a composed man whose face gave very little away until he chose to give something. Warren arrived at Whitmore and Associates at 8:54 a.m. The office was on the 22nd floor of a steel and glass building on Peachtree Street, the kind of place where the reception area had original art and the coffee was French press. He came with Miriam and Celeste Ashford, who had spent 8 months researching the buyer and the terms and had promised Warren that everything was airtight. Reginald met them in Conference Room C, a corner space with floor-to-ceiling windows and a table that sat 12. He shook hands. He offered coffee. He opened his leather portfolio and aligned his pen with the edge of his notepad, in the way men do when they are about to deliver news they have been instructed to deliver with precision. "Before we begin," Reginald said, "I need to confirm where is Mrs. Whitfield." Warren blinked. "She's not involved in this transaction." "I see." Reginald's face gave nothing. "One moment, please." He stepped out. Warren looked at Miriam. Miriam looked at Celeste. Celeste frowned at her folder. Reginald returned 2 minutes later with a single document. He placed it in the center of the table. "This is the escrow condition filed with the title company in 2019, he said. "It requires Mrs. Whitfield's co-signature on any sale or transfer of the Birmingham property, as well as her signed acknowledgement of advisory review. Without both, the escrow account remains frozen and no proceeds can be released." The meeting lasted 4 minutes. Nothing was signed. Warren left with his face the color of chalk. Celeste Ashford, who had built a reputation on finding documents nobody else could find, had missed the one document that mattered because it had never been filed publicly. It sat in Preston Gallagher's office in a folder marked with my name, waiting for the day someone tried to move without me. I wasn't in that boardroom when Fontaine read the clause that ended Warren's certainty in 4 minutes flat, but Clayton Mercer recounted every detail, and I sat in room 214, holding the phone that would not stop trying to reach me. Call 32 came in at 9:17 a.m. Warren's name lit up the screen. I watched it pulse 3 times, then go dark. I turned the phone face down. The coffee maker on the credenza had one of those single-serve pods. I brewed a cup, dark roast, too hot, no cream, and drank it standing by the window. It was the first thing I had consumed in 24 hours that was not water or bitterness. Outside, Birmingham was waking up. Traffic thickened on the streets below. Somewhere in Atlanta, my son was realizing that the empire he thought he had taken was still locked behind a door I had built years ago. I drank my coffee. I did not answer my phone, and I waited for the next move because I knew it was coming. 4 hours after the signing collapsed, Celeste Ashford sat in her attorney's office, surrounded by 8 months of work that had just become evidence of her own blindness. I learned about that meeting the way I learned most things in Atlanta's professional networks, through connections built over 30 years of keeping my word so consistently that people told me things without being asked. Celeste had gone directly from Whitmore and Associates to the offices of Lawrence Pritchard, who was 62 and one of Atlanta's most expensive healthcare policy attorneys, and had been Celeste's counsel for the past 8 months of research into my legal position. She spread her files across his conference table: public records, Georgia business registrations, property ownership documents, LLC operating agreements, tax filings, Medicare certifications. She had color-coded everything, cross-referenced dates, built timelines that tracked every transaction from 2015 through the Birmingham expansion in 2019. "I searched every public filing," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands, according to the associate who was present, were not. "Corporate records, property deeds, operating agreements. Where is this clause?" Pritchard had spent 40 minutes reviewing her materials before he answered. He was the kind of attorney who charged $800 an hour and earned every penny by never speaking faster than he thought. "It's a private side agreement," he said finally, "executed at closing, held within the escrow structure. It requires no public registration, no corporate filing, no disclosure outside the transaction parties. It exists only within Preston Gallagher's closing package." Celeste stared at him. "Can I challenge it?" Pritchard took 40 seconds before answering. "I know this because the associate who recounted it to me specifically noted the silence, the way Pritchard aligned his pen with the edge of his legal pad before he spoke." "No," he said. One word. 8 months of research, 160 billable hours, and the answer was a single syllable. Celeste had operated within the wrong perimeter. She had searched every public database, filed requests with 3 county clerk offices, reviewed corporate governance documents that went back to the network's founding in 1989. But private trust agreements, the kind executed between parties who have known each other for decades and have no legal obligation to announce their arrangements to the world, do not appear in public records. They exist in filing cabinets in attorneys' offices in escrow instructions that never see daylight until someone tries to move without permission. She had been searching for a wall. She found out it was a vault. I learned about Celeste's afternoon through connections I had built over 30 years in Atlanta's professional networks, the kind of connections you earn by keeping your word so consistently that people tell you things without being asked. By the time Celeste left Pritchard's office at 3:45 p.m., I already knew the meeting had lasted 90 minutes and ended with no strategy, no challenge, and no way forward. I was still in room 214 at the Redmont Hotel when the voicemail arrived at 4:17 p.m. Reginald Fontaine's voice was calm, precise, and carefully neutral. "Mrs. Whitfield, this is Reginald Fontaine with Whitmore & Associates. Mr. Gallagher has asked me to reach out directly. The matter is time-sensitive. He would prefer to speak with you before end of business today. Please return this call at your earliest convenience." I played it twice. Then I called Clayton Mercer. "Preston sent Fontaine," I said. "I heard." Clayton's voice carried the faint sound of traffic. He was in his car. "What did the message say?" I read it back to him word for word. Clayton was quiet for a moment. Then, "Preston didn't send Fontaine to pressure you. He sent him because he knows you well enough to know you haven't disappeared, you've withdrawn. Those are different things. He's asking permission to speak, not demanding an audience." "What does that tell you?" "That he understands you hold the leverage," Clayton said. "He's not negotiating around you. He's negotiating with you." I looked out the window. Birmingham's afternoon light was softening, turning the buildings amber. My phone showed 41 missed calls now. None of them were from Preston. He had sent his representative to leave one message, and then he had waited. "Tell Fontaine I'll speak with Preston tomorrow morning," I said. 8 a.m. "Not today." "No." Clayton understood. "I'll relay it." I hung up and sat in the chair by the window with the hotel notepad in my lap. Preston Gallagher was 62, the same age as my late husband would have been if he had lived. Preston had been our attorney since 2011, had handled the estate planning after my husband passed. In 2018, had structured the Birmingham expansion in 2019. He had known both of us for over a decade. He knew how I built things. He knew why I built them the way I did. And he had built that escrow clause into the closing documents in 2019 without my asking him to do it. I sat with that 72-hour window in my hands and thought about my late husband. He had passed in 2018, a year before Warren came to me with the expansion idea, and Preston had known both of us for over a decade. He had watched me build the rehabilitation network from nothing. He had seen me navigate federal audits, Medicare recertifications, state licensing reviews. He had watched me make decisions that protected the business even when those decisions were not popular. He had put my name on those documents because he knew what Warren did not, that the person who builds the foundation is the person who controls the structure. I wrote on the hotel notepad 72 hours, underlined it once, set the pen down. Then I did what I hadn't done since arriving in Birmingham. I poured a fresh cup of coffee from the room machine and drank it all while it was still hot. Not because I was thirsty, because I was ready. That same evening, my son sat in his apartment in the dark with his laptop open, searching for the clause that had just ended his certainty. I learned about Warren's evening through people who understood that some conversations are too important not to share. He had returned from the collapsed signing at Whitmore & Associates and gone straight to his computer. Miriam sat on the couch behind him, silent, watching the blue glow of the screen illuminate his face as he searched. He started with the Georgia Secretary of State's corporate registry, typed my name, found the Rehabilitation Network's original articles of incorporation from 1989 listings for 3 subsidiaries, annual reports that showed revenue growth but revealed nothing about ownership structure. He searched property records in Fulton County, then Jefferson County, Alabama. Found the Birmingham land purchase from 2019, my name on the deed, exactly as Reginald Fontaine had said. But the escrow clause itself appeared nowhere. He had called his attorney at 6 p.m. The conversation lasted 11 minutes and ended with a single conclusion delivered in the careful language attorneys use when they are telling you there is no path forward. The condition is enforceable. Private side agreements don't require public filing. You can't challenge it without Preston Gallagher's authorization. Warren had hung up and sat staring at the laptop screen for 20 minutes without moving. Then he remembered something Preston had said 2 months earlier. It had been a routine meeting mid-May in Preston's office on the 14th floor overlooking Peachtree Street. Warren had been reviewing the Birmingham timeline, confident and precise, explaining how the expansion would position the network for acquisition by the National Hospital System that had been courting us since 2022. Preston had listened the way he always listened, leaning back in his chair, fingers steepled, expression unreadable. Then Preston had asked a question that seemed at the time hypothetical. "Warren, let me ask you something. What if your mother isn't here tomorrow?" Warren had answered without hesitation. "Nothing changes. The project is structured to stand on its own. We've built redundancy into every level of operations." Preston had looked at him for a long moment. Then he had nodded once and changed the subject. Warren had thought it was a satisfied nod. A confirmation that he had given the right answer demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that proved he was ready to lead without me. Sitting in his apartment in the dark, he understood he had failed a test he didn't know he was taking. Preston hadn't been asking whether the project could function without me. He had been asking whether Warren understood what I had built, why I had built it the way I did, and what would happen if someone tried to move it without understanding the foundations. Warren's answer, confident, certain, dismissive of my continued presence, had told Preston everything he needed to know. I learned about Warren's evening through people who understood that some conversations are too important not to share, and by morning when Preston called at exactly 8 o'clock, I had already spent 12 years learning what his silences meant. The phone rang while I stood by the window in room 214, watching Birmingham wake up under a sky the color of brushed steel. I answered on the second ring. "Constance," Preston said. Not Mrs. Whitfield. Not a greeting. Just my name spoken in the tone he used when business could wait, and the person mattered first. "Are you all right?" I had not expected that question. I had expected terms, timelines, pressure disguised as concern for the transaction. Instead, he was asking about me. "I've been better," I said. "I heard about the party." His voice was careful. "Not the details, just enough to know it wasn't what you deserved." I closed my eyes. Warren made his position clear. "He made his ignorance clear," Preston said. "There's a difference." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "That clause," Preston continued, "the escrow condition, I requested it, not you. You asked me multiple times over the past 4 years to take your name out of the operating structure to let Warren hold the primary position. I refused every time." I opened my eyes. Outside traffic moved in slow rivers along the street below. "Why?" "Because I didn't invest in the project," Preston said. "I invested in your presence in the project. My equity partners invested in you, your track record, your judgment, your ability to build something that lasts. When you asked me to step back, I told them what you wanted. They told me the same thing I'm telling you now. No." And I sat down in the chair by the window. The leather was cool against my back. "The 72-hour window," Preston said. "That comes from the equity partners. They're willing to hold the transaction open for 3 days while this resolves. After that, I'll have to halt the closing and restructure from scratch. The buyer won't wait. The deal will collapse. And if I sign? Then the sale proceeds as planned. Warren gets his outcome. You get your exit." I looked at the notepad on the nightstand. 72 hours underlined once. "And if I don't?" Preston was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried something I had heard before, but never quite understood until now, respect that bordered on protectiveness. "Then Warren learns what you already know," he said. "That the person who builds the foundation is the person who controls the structure. And if he wants to move forward, he'll have to ask permission instead of assuming authority." I sat with that 72-hour window in my hands and thought about my husband. He had built Whitfield Rehabilitation with me, from the ground up, passed in 2018, a year before Warren brought me the expansion idea, and Preston had known both of us knew what we had created together, knew what it had cost to build something that mattered. Preston said something else before we ended the call that morning, something I didn't understand until much later. "Your husband would want you to protect what you built," he said quietly, "not just the network yourself." I sat with those words long after the call ended, understanding why Preston had refused to let me step back. Understanding that protection sometimes looks like control until you realize who it's protecting you from. The woman who arrived at the Redmont Hotel lobby that afternoon was not someone I expected to see, and she had not been sent by anyone. Dorothy Caldwell was in her late 60s, a woman who had worked as Preston Gallagher's executive secretary for 15 years before retiring, and she had driven to Birmingham on her own because she believed some truths mattered more than professional discretion. The front desk called at 2:30 p.m. When they said her name, I paused before answering. "Send her up," I said. She arrived wearing a navy cardigan and low heels, her hands folded in front of her. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "I worked with Preston Gallagher for 15 years before I retired. He didn't send me. I came because I felt you needed to know something." I stepped aside. She walked in and I closed the door. We sat in the chairs by the window. Dorothy set her purse down and looked at me with the expression people wear when they have carried something heavy for a long time and are finally setting it down. "3 years ago," she said, "you closed the first equity investment round for the Birmingham expansion. Do you remember?" "Yes." "I sat in Preston's office the day after that closing. He called you in for what he said was a procedural signature, but it wasn't. He had drafted a bonus agreement. $15 million payable to you personally as compensation for the personal guarantee you had provided to secure the bank's participation." I remembered that meeting, the document Preston had slid across his desk, the number written in both figures and words. "You read it," Dorothy said. "Preston told you that you had earned it, that the deal would not have closed without your guarantee, that the equity partners had approved the payment unanimously." I nodded. "And you refused it," Dorothy said quietly. "You signed a declination, and you said something I have never forgotten." The room was silent, except for the faint hum of traffic through the window. "You said, 'Let everyone believe my son is making this happen.'" The words hung between us. Something tightened in my chest. "I sat in that room," Dorothy continued. "I took the notes. I filed the declination in Preston's private records, not the corporate file. And your son never knew. Preston honored your request. No one outside that office ever learned about the offer or your refusal." I looked out the window. The light was beginning to soften. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I heard what happened at your birthday party. I heard what your son said to you in front of everyone you had built that network for. And I thought you should know that someone besides Preston remembers what you gave up so he could believe he had earned what you handed him." I didn't say a word while Dorothy Caldwell told that story, because there are some truths you cannot defend or explain. You can only let them stand in the air and see whether the person hearing them understands what they mean. She stayed for 15 minutes. We talked about her retirement, about Preston's quiet kindnesses over the years. When she stood to leave, she touched my hand. "You built something that mattered," she said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I walked her to the door, watched her disappear down the hallway. Then I closed the door and stood in the center of room 214, holding the weight of a choice I had made 3 years ago that I had never regretted until this moment. That same evening, Miriam drove to her mother's house in Buckhead. I learned about this later, the way I learned most things that happened outside my direct sight, through people who understood that some information travels along channels built over decades. Miriam arrived at 7 p.m. carrying takeout. They sat in the living room talking in circles about the collapsed signing, about Warren's frustration about the clause that had appeared from nowhere. At 7:30, Celeste's phone rang. She looked at the screen, then at Miriam. "I need to take this," she said. "It's Lawrence." She walked into the kitchen. The door didn't close all the way. The latch had been broken for months, and Miriam sat on the couch hearing her mother's voice through the gap. "Lawrence," Celeste said. Her tone was professional, controlled. "Yes, I reviewed the documents again this afternoon." Miriam stood and walked quietly toward the kitchen. She filled the kettle at the sink, and through the cracked door, she heard Lawrence Pritchard's voice on speakerphone, tinny but clear. "Celeste, are you certain Constance holds no remaining rights in the current structure?" There was a pause. Miriam's hand stilled on the kettle handle. "I haven't found anything in public records that suggests she does," Celeste said. Another pause, longer. "That wasn't the question I asked Celeste," Pritchard said. The silence that followed stretched for 5 seconds. Then 10. Miriam stood frozen, listening to her mother say nothing. Finally, Celeste spoke. "I'm operating on the available evidence." "I understand," Pritchard said. His voice carried weight. "But available evidence and actual knowledge are not the same thing. If you're advising Warren to proceed on the assumption that his mother has been fully removed from the ownership structure, you need to be certain that assumption is correct." "I'll keep looking," Celeste said quietly. The call ended. Miriam heard her mother set the phone down with a soft click. I didn't know that night that Miriam stood in her mother's kitchen, hearing an answer that wasn't an answer, a statement of what hadn't been found rather than what was known. But some truths find their own way to the person who needs to hear them. Miriam set the kettle down without pouring the water. She stood in that kitchen, hearing the space between "I haven't found" and "I know," understanding for the first time since the birthday party that the story she had been told might not be the story that was true. Clayton Mercer called at exactly 6:23 a.m. 23 minutes after I had sent him the documents. I was awake. I had been awake since 5 o'clock, sitting in the chair by the window watching Birmingham's sky turn from black to gray. The phone rang, and I answered on the first ring. "Constance," Clayton said. His voice was alert-focused. "You're in a stronger position than you probably realize. That's not comfort, that's an assessment." I leaned back in the chair. "Tell me." "The core land is in your personal name. I filed a protective notice at Fulton County Superior Court this morning to block any transfer or encumbrance without your signature. That's the first wall." I closed my eyes. "The DCH medical operating license," Clayton continued, "lists you as the primary operator, not Warren. Under Alabama healthcare regulations, that license cannot transfer without your written consent. That's the second wall. And the third? The Medicare certification," Clayton said. "Your signature is the one on file with CMS. Any change to operational control requires notification and recertification. You hold the authority to block or approve that process." I opened my eyes. Outside, the streets were beginning to fill with morning traffic. The sky had turned the color of steel. "3 walls," I said quietly. "3 separate legal structures," Clayton confirmed. "Each one sufficient on its own. Together, they're a fortress. Warren's attorney contacted Fontaine this morning trying to argue the clause wasn't properly incorporated into the sale agreement. My assessment meritless. It won't survive serious review." I sat with that for a moment. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the heating unit. "How long do I have?" "The 72-hour window expires at 9 a.m. tomorrow," Clayton said. "After that, Preston's equity partners will require him to halt the closing and restructure from scratch. The buyer won't wait. The deal collapses. And if I sign, then Warren gets what he wanted. You get removed from the structure the sale proceeds, and he walks away believing he won." I looked at the notepad on the nightstand. 72 hours underlined once, nearly gone. "What would you do?" I asked. Clayton was quiet for 3 seconds. "Then I would protect what I built. But that's not a legal opinion, that's personal." I thanked him and hung up. Sat in that chair watching the city wake up below me, thinking about walls. If you have ever built something from nothing, protected something you created with your own hands, you understand what those 3 legal filings meant, not just documents, but walls. The kind that hold when everything else falls. I poured coffee from the room machine, drank it standing by the window, and I waited. Clayton called back at 12:30 p.m. I was reading through the operating agreement for the 3rd time when the phone rang. His voice sounded different, tighter, more focused. "Constance, I need to tell you something. I've been reviewing the full operating agreement since our call this morning. And this project isn't $180 million, he said. That's just the initial capital for Phase 1. I set the document down on the desk. "What do you mean?" "Before I reveal what that project was actually worth, comment A, if you think Warren knew the full value, or B, if you think he was blind to it. Add one brief reason. Please note what follows contains recreated details for storytelling purposes, but the message is what I hope stays with you. The operating agreement has trigger provisions," Clayton said. "Once Phase 1 completes, which it will within 18 months, it automatically activates a healthcare investment fund. Nationwide expansion. Capital commitments from 3 institutional investors that are already secured and documented in appendices Warren apparently never read." My hand stilled on the phone. "The true value of the entire chain upon full activation," Clayton continued, his voice careful and precise, "is nearly $600 million. Warren never read as far as the trigger provisions. He only knew the first number." I sat down slowly in the chair by the window. $600 million. Not 180, 600. "He was going to sell access to that," I said quietly, "for what he thought was 180 million, not knowing the rest." "Yes," Clayton said. "And he was going to do it by removing you, the only person whose signature activates the trigger provisions in the first place. Without you, the Phase 2 capital commitments collapse. The institutional investors pull out. The chain stops at 180 million and never grows beyond that." I closed my eyes. "He doesn't know," I said. "No," Clayton agreed. "He doesn't." I sat with that $600 million figure in my hands, not because it was my money, but because I understood what Warren didn't. He had no idea what he was standing on, and people never appreciate the foundation until the foundation is gone. Clayton sent the documents by secure email 20 minutes later. I read them in the chair by the window in room 214. Every page, every clause, every trigger provision that Warren had never bothered to read because he assumed he already understood what he was selling. I digitally signed them at 2 p.m., filed them back to Clayton. And for the first time since leaving my son's birthday party, I felt something in my chest settle into place. Not victory, not relief, just the feeling of a person who has finally stopped allowing herself to be hurt. But that afternoon, I would face a choice that could undo everything I had just built. That afternoon, I sat at the desk in room 214 and drafted a document that would have given my son everything. The choice I had been avoiding since signing Clayton's protective filings stared back at me from the hotel notepad. I could hold the fortress, or I could tear down every wall I had just built and hand Warren what he wanted: complete control. My name removed his authority unquestioned. I wrote it out by hand, careful block letters, the kind that leave no room for misinterpretation. I hereby transfer all ownership rights, operating licenses, and certification authority related to the Birmingham expansion project to Warren James Lockwood, effective immediately. All previous restrictions, conditions, and requirements for my co-signature are waived. This transfer is irrevocable. I signed my name at the bottom, dated it, set the pen down. Then I called Clayton. "I need you to listen to something," I said when he answered. "All right." I read him the document, every word. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, there was silence on the line. 10 seconds, 20. I counted them. Finally, Clayton spoke. His voice was quiet, careful. "Constance, if your husband were alive, if he were sitting in that room with you right now, would he want you to keep sacrificing like this?" I opened my mouth. No sound came out. "Would he?" Clayton asked again, gentler this time. 30 seconds passed. I sat at that desk holding a piece of paper that represented 34 years of putting my son first, of stepping back so he could step forward, of refusing bonuses and declining credit and watching him believe he had built what I had handed him. I set the paper down on the desk, picked it up, tore it once down the middle, then again crosswise, 4 pieces. This was the first time in Warren's entire life that I chose to protect myself instead of protecting him. "Thank you," I said to Clayton. My voice sounded strange in my own ears. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "You just needed someone to ask the question." I hung up and sat looking at the 4 torn pieces of paper on the desk. Outside, Birmingham's afternoon light was fading. The sky had turned amber. I swept the pieces into the wastebasket and did not look at them again. At 7 p.m., Clayton called for a scheduled video review of the protective filings. We went through each document methodically: the land notice, the DCH license protections, the Medicare certification barriers. Everything was in place. Everything was enforceable. Then Clayton said something that made me understand how long Preston Gallagher had been protecting me. "I spoke with Reginald Fontaine this afternoon," Clayton said. "He mentioned something you should know. 2 months ago, when Celeste Ashford first began digging into the ownership records, Preston met with Warren privately." I leaned closer to the laptop screen. Preston asked him directly, "What if your mother isn't here tomorrow? What happens to the project?" I felt something cold settle in my chest. "Warren answered without hesitation," Clayton continued. "He said nothing changes. The project is structured to stand on its own." I closed my eyes. "That same day," Clayton said quietly, "Preston ordered his legal team to audit every clause in the operating agreement and ensure the escrow condition was airtight. He fortified your protections before you even knew they needed fortifying. You need to understand something about love. The deepest kind, the parental kind that runs so far down it reaches foundations you didn't know existed. Sometimes the person you love most is the one you must learn to protect yourself from. But sometimes, if you're very lucky, other people see what you cannot see and build walls for you before you know you need them." Preston had known before I did. He had heard my son declare me unnecessary and had quietly reinforced every legal structure that kept Warren from acting on that certainty. "How did Preston look when Warren answered?" I asked. Clayton paused. Fontaine said Preston's face didn't change. He thanked Warren for his time, walked him to the door, and the moment Warren left, Preston picked up the phone and called the legal team. I sat with that for a long moment. The room was dark now except for the glow of the laptop screen. "He never told me," I said. "No," Clayton agreed. "He wouldn't. Preston doesn't do this work for gratitude. He does it because it's right." We finished the call 20 minutes later. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark thinking about tests and answers and the difference between what we want our children to say and what they actually believe. Warren arrived at 10:30 p.m. I heard the knock, 3 soft taps, hesitant, and I knew before I opened the door who it would be. He stood in the hallway wearing jeans and a t-shirt. His hair uncombed, his face the kind of tired that comes from 3 hours of driving while processing something you don't want to face. He hadn't called ahead. He hadn't told Miriam or Celeste. He had simply gotten in his car and driven. "Mom," he said quietly. I stepped aside without speaking. He walked past me into room 214. I closed the door. He didn't take the chair by the window that was mine, and some part of him understood he had no right to claim it. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed with his hands folded between his knees, looking at the floor. I stood by the window and waited. "I don't know where to start," Warren said finally. His voice was different, smaller. The confidence that had carried him through the birthday party, through the collapsed signing, through every phone call I hadn't answered, it was gone. What sat on that bed was not the man who had stood in front of 70 people and called me a roadblock. It was my son, 40 years old, and stripped of every certainty he had built his adult life around. I looked at him sitting on the edge of that hotel bed in Birmingham, and he looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but inside, as if the suit of confidence he had worn for years could no longer hide what lay beneath it. I let him sit with that silence for a while, 30 seconds, maybe 40 time, measured not by the clock, but by how long it takes for a person to realize they can no longer hide from what they came to face. Then I said, "Start with the question you haven't dared ask Warren." I stood up, walked to the briefcase Clayton had sent, and pulled out the files, 4 pages that would end every lie Warren had been living inside. He watched me from the edge of the bed, his shoulders hunched, his hands still folded between his knees. I carried the documents to the small table by the window and placed them down one at a time. No preliminary explanation, no context. I just let Warren read. The first page was a personal mortgage guarantee from 2021. The bank had rejected Warren's loan application for the initial property survey and feasibility study. His business credit was insufficient, his collateral weak. I had stepped in with my personal assets, my reputation built over 33 years, and guaranteed the loan myself. Warren's name appeared on the final disbursement documents, but mine was the signature the bank had required before releasing a single dollar. I watched his eyes move across the page, saw his jaw tighten. The second page was an emergency email from April 2022. One of Warren's initial investment partners had withdrawn at the last minute, leaving an $8 million gap in the land acquisition funding. The purchase would have collapsed. I had mortgaged property I owned, outright land worth considerably more than $8 million to cover the shortfall within 48 hours. Warren had been told the partner came back. He never knew I was the one who filled the gap. His breathing changed, slower, deeper. The third page was meeting minutes from June 2022. Preston Gallagher and the equity partners had offered me the CEO role for the expansion project. The offer was documented formal with compensation terms that would have made me the highest-paid healthcare executive in the Southeast. I had declined, in writing, and I had requested specifically in language Preston preserved in the minutes that Warren be placed at the head of the operational structure instead. Warren's hands shook slightly as he held the page. The fourth page was the email from 3 years ago, the bonus agreement, $15 million offered as compensation for my personal guarantee. I had refused it, and in my response I had written the words Dorothy Caldwell had remembered. "Let everyone believe my son is making this happen." Warren set the last page down on the table. His eyes were red. 4 times, Warren, I said quietly. 4 separate times I stepped in to save what you were building, and you never knew. He didn't speak. He sat staring at the documents spread across that table like evidence at a trial. There are moments in every parent's life when you must choose. Do you protect your child from the truth, or do you protect the truth from your child's denial? I had spent 34 years choosing the first. Tonight, I chose the second. I walked back to the chair by the window and sat down. The room was quiet except for the faint sound of traffic from the street below. When Celeste asked you if I was still necessary, I said, "When she asked you that question directly, what did you tell her?" Warren's head came up. His face was pale. "Mom, what did you tell her, Warren?" The silence stretched. 10 seconds, 20. I waited. Finally he spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper. "She met me privately, without Miriam. 3 months ago, maybe 4. She showed me her research, all the public records. She'd pulled the corporate filings, the property documents. She told me you were keeping your presence in the project not for business reasons, but to maintain control over me." I felt something cold settle in my chest, but I didn't move. "She said you couldn't let go," Warren continued. His words came faster now, like a confession he'd been holding back for months. "That you were blocking my ability to lead independently. That as long as you were in the structure, investors would always see me as your son, instead of as the executive running the project." "And you believed her," I said. Warren's face crumpled. I wanted to believe it. Why? Because believing it was easier, he said. His voice broke. Because if I believed you were the problem, then I didn't have to question whether I had actually earned what I had. I didn't have to wonder if people respected me for my work, or because you had built the foundation I was standing on. He put his face in his hands. I wanted the feeling that this was mine, Mom, not ours. Mine. And Celeste gave me permission to believe that the only thing standing between me and that feeling was you. I sat in that chair watching my 40-year-old son break apart in a hotel room in Birmingham. He wasn't crying yet, but he was close. His breathing was ragged, his shoulders shaking. So when she asked if you were still necessary, I said quietly, you told her no. Yes, Warren whispered. God help me, yes. Then he did cry. Not the quiet tears that come from sadness, but the kind that come from shame, so deep it reaches bone. He sat on the edge of that bed with his face in his hands and wept like a child who has just understood the magnitude of what he's done. I didn't go to him. I didn't offer comfort. I sat in my chair by the window and let him sit with the truth he had just spoken aloud. I sat with my 40-year-old son crying in a hotel room in Birmingham and thought that this was the truest moment we had shared in years. No project, no roles, no one having to be anything except exactly what we were. A mother who had given too much, and a son who was finally understanding what that meant. After a long time, Warren lifted his head. His face was blotchy, his eyes swollen. He looked at the 4 documents still spread across the table. I didn't know, he said. His voice was hoarse. I looked back at him. I know you didn't know, Warren. That was my choice. And that was my mistake, not because I protected you, but because I protected you to the point that you never learned what was actually solid beneath your feet. He sat with those words for a very long time. Outside Birmingham's streets had gone quiet. It was past midnight now. Day 4 had begun. I told Warren what moving forward required, and it was not an apology. He sat on the edge of that hotel bed looking like a man who had just discovered the ground beneath him was not what he thought it was. The documents were still spread across the table. The evidence of what I had given, what I had refused, what I had protected him from knowing. You need to go home, I said, and you need to tell Miriam everything. His head came up. The escrow condition? I continued. The anchor parcel. The $15 million I refused. The mortgage I took to cover your partner's withdrawal. All of it. Not an edited version, not a version designed to protect anyone. The complete truth. Warren's face went pale. Mom, your wife needs to understand the full picture before we can call ourselves a family, I said. She stood in my house and told me I was blocking your future. She needs to know what that future was actually built on. What if... Warren stopped. Started again. What if she doesn't? Then you'll have to decide what matters more, I said. Her comfort or your integrity. He stood slowly, walked to the table and picked up the 4 documents, folding them carefully. He put them in his jacket pocket. At the door, he stopped with his hand on the frame. He didn't turn around. Do you forgive me, Mom? I looked at his back, at the slope of his shoulders, at the son I had protected for 40 years, who was finally learning what protection had cost. I don't know, Warren, I said quietly. Ask me again when you've done what needs to be done. He stood there for 5 seconds, then he opened the door and left. I sat back down in room 214 alone. The clock on the nightstand read 12:47 a.m. Day 4 had been underway for less than an hour. I picked up my phone and called Clayton. Prepare the restructuring documents, I said when he answered. I'm coming back to Atlanta tomorrow. Understood, Clayton said. I could hear him moving, already reaching for his laptop. You have 14 hours left in the 72-hour window. Time enough, I said. I hung up, looked out the window at Birmingham's empty streets. And I thought about forgiveness, how it's not something you grant because someone asks for it, but something you give when they've proven they understand why it was necessary in the first place. 3 weeks later, in the first week of August, Preston Gallagher asked me to meet him at his private office. Not the conference room, not the space where deals got made and documents got signed. His personal office on the 14th floor, the one with photographs of his family on the walls and books that showed actual wear from being read. I arrived at 2 p.m. He was waiting. Constance, he said, standing to shake my hand. Thank you for coming. We sat in the chairs by his window overlooking Peachtree Street. Atlanta in August, hot, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the pavement. Preston had a leather portfolio on the table between us. I want to show you something, he said. He opened the portfolio and slid a document across to me. The header read Veteran Rehabilitation Fund. I looked up at him. $90 million. Preston said. His voice was quiet, deliberate. I established it from the healthcare chain profits over the past 5 years. Money set aside specifically for rehabilitation services for military veterans, the population most underserved by the current healthcare structure. I read the first page, then the second. The fund was real, fully capitalized, legally structured, operational. I want you to manage it, Preston said. I set the document down. Preston, only someone who knows how to hold a promise deserves to manage what I care about most, he said. I've watched you keep your word for 12 years. I've watched you build something that lasts. I've watched you protect people who didn't even know they needed protecting. He leaned forward slightly. Warren will have no part in this fund, Preston continued. Not as punishment, but as reality. He hasn't earned that level of trust. This is yours, to build, to run, to expand however you see fit within the mission parameters. I looked at the portfolio. $90 million. Not for the expansion Warren had tried to control, not for the network I had built over 30 years, for something new, something mine. Why now? I asked. Preston smiled slightly. It was the first time I had seen that expression on his face in months. Because now is the first time you are ready to accept something for yourself, he said. You've spent 3 decades putting everyone else first, building things and handing them to other people, refusing credit, refusing compensation, refusing recognition. He tapped the portfolio. This time he said, you don't get to refuse. I sat with that for a long moment. Outside Atlanta moved through its afternoon. Traffic and heat and the city I had spent 31 years building something in that no one could ever take from me. If you have ever been told that your absence would be a gift, that the best thing you could offer the people you love is to disappear. You understand what I felt in Preston's office that afternoon. Not triumph, but the quiet irony of knowing what they lost when they thought they were winning. I signed the acceptance documents at 3:15 p.m. Preston witnessed the signature. And just like that, I became the director of a fund worth more than Warren had ever comprehended the expansion could be. I drove home after that meeting. Atlanta, in August, hot, humid, that heavy air native to this city where I've spent 31 years building something that no one can ever take from me. I thought about what Miriam had said at the birthday party, about roadblocks and letting go, and how much easier everything would be if I just stepped aside. And I laughed, not loud, not gloating, just the quiet laugh of a person who has finally understood a very funny thing about what happens when you try to erase someone who knows how to build. The boardroom was exactly as I remembered it. Same table, same chairs, same water glasses already poured. The room where Warren's certainty had ended in 4 minutes flat was now the room where everything would be made right. I arrived first with Clayton. We took seats near the windows overlooking Peachtree Street, Atlanta, spread below us in late August, heat waves rising off the pavement you could almost see with the naked eye. Preston arrived at 9:02 a.m., not a representative. Preston himself, charcoal suit, leather portfolio. He walked directly to me, extended his hand, and held it a moment longer than formality required. Thank you for coming back, he said quietly. Thank you for waiting, I said. Warren arrived at 9:08. Alone. No Miriam, no attorney, no Celeste. Navy suit, white shirt, tie, nodded carefully, the face of a man who had spent a month learning what humility actually costs. He sat across from me. Our eyes met for 3 seconds. He nodded once. I nodded back. Reginald distributed the documents. 23 revised pages. Page 7 listed the equity stakeholders. My name appeared first, Constance Eleanor Whitfield, majority equity holder. Operational authority, co-signature required on all transfers exceeding $5 million. Page 11 listed Warren as Chief Operating Officer, reporting to the board compensation, tied to independently audited performance metrics. I signed page 7 at 9:14 a.m. My signature looked exactly as it had for 31 years. Clear, deliberate, leaving no room for question. Warren's turn came at 9:16. He picked up the pen, turned to page 11, and read the entire page, even though he had reviewed these documents a dozen times already. Then he paused. No one moved. The silence held itself while Warren sat with whatever he was sitting with the full weight of what his name on that line meant about every decision that had led here. He signed, slowly, deliberately, each letter formed with the care of a man who understood exactly what he was doing. He set the pen down and looked up. What passed between us was not forgiveness, not yet. It was acknowledgement, the kind that matters more than apologies because it comes from understanding rather than regret. The signing concluded at 9:31 a.m. Preston walked me to the elevator. "Your husband would be proud," he said. I didn't trust my voice. I nodded. I sat alone in that boardroom afterward, cold coffee in hand, my name in the correct places on 23 pages. The last time I had sat in this room, no one was permitted to sign anything. Today I finished that coffee cold as it was. In September, the story of the failed July deal filtered through Atlanta's professional networks the way things do in cities where everyone knows everyone who matters. Not gossip pattern recognition. Attorneys and equity partners noted which names appeared near which outcomes. Celeste Ashford's research had been meticulous. Her conclusions had been wrong. That distinction was not lost on anyone paying attention. Two longtime allies answered her calls politely but briefly. One ended with, "I hope everything works out for y'all." Celeste would have understood exactly what that meant. Southern courtesy masking dismissal, a door closing without a sound. In late September, the Governance Committee for a Healthcare Policy Board she had served for 8 years reviewed term renewals. 12 names were called to continue. Hers was not among them. No confrontation, no accusation. Just the quiet professional consequence of being associated with failure in a field where reputation is the only currency that matters. I wasn't in that room. I didn't ask for anything. The story simply found its way to the people who needed to know, and they made their own assessments. No one needed to speak ill of Celeste Ashford. The facts spoke for themselves. Miriam called me in October. I was in my kitchen making coffee when her name appeared on my screen, a name I hadn't seen there in 3 years, not since before the birthday party, back when family dinners still happened and holidays meant something other than performance. I answered on the third ring. "How are you, Mom?" Her voice was quiet, uncertain. She had not called me Mom in 3 years. "I'm well," I said. "How are you?" "I'm close," she said. "The baby. Any day now." Then, after a pause, I overheard a conversation my mother and her attorney back in July. The kitchen door didn't close all the way. I realized she had been guessing, not knowing, operating on assumptions, not evidence, that I had performed a script someone else wrote and handed to me. I waited. "I can't apologize over the phone," she said. "Can you come to the hospital when it's time?" I looked out my kitchen window at October Atlanta, the light lower and slower, the kind of autumn clarity that shows you everything you missed in summer's heat. I thought about a baby about to be born into a family that had just survived itself. About what that child would need from her grandmother, not the kind anyone at that birthday party had predicted, not built on performance or permission, but built on my own terms. When Warren calls, I said I'll come, and I meant it. Warren called at 6:47 on a December morning. 7 words. "Mom, she's here. She's perfect." I set the phone down, finished my coffee without rushing, pulled on my coat, picked up my keys, and drove to Piedmont Atlanta Hospital, through a city just waking beneath a sky the color of brushed steel. I didn't hurry. I knew where I was going. I knew what I would find. And for the first time in 5 months, I was walking towards something entirely on my own terms. Warren met me at the maternity room door, red-eyed, wrinkled shirt, wearing the particular exhaustion of a man who has just watched his wife bring life into the world and knows he will never be the same. He stepped aside without speaking. Miriam sat in the hospital bed in a pale blue gown, hair pulled back, her face tired and radiant, in the way only new mothers look. And in her arms, wrapped in the standard pink and blue striped hospital blanket, was my granddaughter. 7 pounds, 2 ounces. Born at 6:34 a.m., a baby who had arrived into a family that had just survived itself and whose face held no opinion yet about any of it. Miriam looked up when I entered. Our eyes met. Neither of us smiled. What passed between us was not performance. It was acknowledgement. "Here she is, Mom," she said quietly. She extended the baby toward me with both hands. "I want you to be the first to hold her. That night at the party, I used this very child to threaten you. Today, I want her to grow up with the grandmother I once tried to steal from her." I took the baby carefully. She was warm and impossibly small. Her tiny fist curled against my chest, her breathing soft and even. Warren stood in the corner, quietly crying. I didn't look at him. I looked at her, this face that knew nothing of Birmingham, or room 214, or the 5 months that had brought us all to this room. She knew only that she was being held. For now, that was enough. I stayed 20 minutes. When I stood to leave, I handed her back carefully. "What's her name?" I asked. "Eleanor. Miriam said softly. After you, if that's all right. I looked at the woman who had stood in my living room 5 months ago and told me the best gift I could give my son was to disappear forever, who had just named her daughter after me. It's all right, I said. I walked to my car carrying something I hadn't carried in. Not the weight of a 7-pound infant, but the knowledge that the family I had just left was not the family I had walked away from in July. The difference between those two versions was measured in every choice made across 5 months. July to December. A birthday party. A microphone. A necessary roadblock. Interstate 20 in the dark. 72 hours in Birmingham. $90 million. A name on page 7. A boardroom. A phone call in October. How are you, Mom? And now this. If you have ever been told your absence would be a gift, that the people who need you most would be better off if you simply disappeared. Understand this. Sometimes the greatest gift you give is showing them exactly what they lose when you are gone. My daughter-in-law once said the best gift I could give my son was to disappear. She didn't know that when I walked out, I took the entire foundation she was standing on with me. I started the engine, pulled into December Atlanta, the city where I had been told to disappear, and where I had for exactly as long as it took to show everyone what disappearing truly meant. Not an ending, a reckoning, on my terms, nobody else's. And to you listening to my story, remember this. The people who tell you to disappear often have no idea what foundation they're standing on. Looking back, I can see where I went wrong in this family drama. I protected my son so completely that he never learned what was actually holding him up. I refused credit, declined compensation, and stepped back so he could step forward, but I protected him to the point that he couldn't recognize the foundation beneath his feet. Don't make my mistake. Love doesn't mean erasing yourself so someone else can shine. Here's what I learned from this family drama. When people demand you disappear, sometimes the most powerful response is showing them exactly what disappears with you. Not revenge clarity. I believe God allowed me to go through this so I could learn that protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. The foundation you build matters more than the credit you receive. And when you know your worth, no one can erase it. These revenge stories with Mom at the center taught me that real power isn't loud. It's documented, legally fortified, and patient. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced family drama like this? Do you think I handled it the right way? Share this with someone who might need to hear these revenge stories with Mom who refused to disappear. And if you want more stories like this, please subscribe to Silent Revenge with Auntie May. Thank you for staying until the very end. Please note that some elements of this story have been fictionalized for reflection and storytelling. What matters most is the message about knowing your worth and protecting what you've built.